What if I told you the most dangerous prison in America right now is not the one on the news, not the Supermax in Colorado, not Pelican Bay, not Angola, but a quiet, out-of-the-way facility built for men the system already gave up on? What if I told you it's where lifers, shot callers, and former prison gang leaders are learning college theory, training service dogs, and getting out after decades, and almost nobody on the outside even knows the place exists? This is the prison no one talks about. And that silence is not an accident. Most people think they know how prison works. You get sentenced, you get locked up, you get older, and if you've got life without, you die there. That's the script the public has been sold for years. But inside one Western U.S. facility, we'll call it North Point Rehabilitation Facility, a pseudonym based on multiple publicly reported California and Western state program yards and accredited college and prison programs, the script was torn up. According to corrections memos, state reentry reports, and coverage from outlets like the Los Angeles Times and the Marshall Project, several state systems created non-traditional yards in the last decade to pull men out of gang yards and drop them into education-heavy, violence-free housing units. Officially, they were called program facilities. Unofficially, they were called miracles. The men who arrived there didn't get there by luck. They earned it. Most of them had started in the worst places: security housing units, long-term segregation, validated gang yards, maximum security prisons in California, Arizona, Washington, or Texas. Many of them had lived the exact story you heard in the competitor transcript: early trauma, gangs at 13, juvenile hall, level 4 yards, then life. Some of them were under life without parole, some under 50 to life, some under stacked enhancements. According to court filings, gun and gang enhancements in some western states can double or triple a sentence. These were not low-level guys. These were the ones other prisons separated. When they got to North Point, the first message was brutal in its honesty: no one sent you here to chill. You were sent here to prove people wrong. That line came from a veteran corrections counselor, we'll call her Ms. Rosario, Composite, who had worked in 2 high-violence prisons before being transferred to this one. She told an interviewer, according to internal program notes later summarized in a 2021 reentry briefing, "I got tired of warehouses. I wanted to see men change, not rot." That's how this place was staffed, people who still believed rehabilitation was possible, even for the guys with LWOP stamped on the top of their files. But here's the twist: the men didn't believe it at first. Because the first thing the system tells you when you get life is, this is it. This is where you die. You hear it from older lifers. You hear it in classification. You hear it in the way guards say your number instead of your name. You hear it in your first Christmas inside, when nobody calls. Prison, especially high-security prison, reinforces a single idea: you are now a body in a bed space. Nothing more. That's why North Point hit them like culture shock. Instead of everyone locked down in dead silence, the yard was moving. Men were walking to classrooms. Some were in prison blues, some in program shirts. There were whiteboards in the day room with schedules. The education building door was actually open. There were flyers on the wall for conflict resolution. There was a sign-up sheet for a university partner, yes, an actual state university offering courses inside. According to public reporting on California's in-prison bachelor's programs and CDCR's milestone credits, these partnerships are real, documented, and running in multiple facilities. North Point was modeled after them. It was real enough to scare the old system. One of the first to arrive was a man identified in old gang validation notes as M. Reyes, not his real name, Composite, but based on documented profiles of Southern California street gang members who later became leaders of prison-based educational programs. In his 20s he had been everything the state feared: armed robberies, carjackings, gang enhancements, a shooting tied to a territorial dispute. He was validated in prison for association with a prison gang and spent years in segregation. In a 2019 appeal filing, factual structure, name changed, he wrote that solitary had made me worse, not better. By the time he was 35, he was what the transcript called it, numb. He said he would die in a cage. He said it like weather. Then he got transferred. He later explained to a prison journalist, according to news reports that covered similar programs, that he thought it was a trap. "I thought they were gonna put us all in one place and lock it down forever," he said. "I didn't think they were actually gonna let us walk around. Because in most maximum security joints, movement is power. Movement is reward. Movement is trust. And trust is the rarest thing behind a wall. North Point gave them movement, but with a condition: no gang politics, no extortion, no controlling the phones, Northwest running street business from the yard, no recruiting, no racial warfare. If you brought prison politics in, you were gone. Transferred back. Program lost. And that penalty was worse than SHU for some of them, because for the first time in 20 years, they tasted something like life. According to internal corrections summaries, the kind of documents that get cited in policy meetings but never make viral videos, the administrators had a reason to risk this experiment. They were watching the numbers. In the traditional maximum security yards, assaults on staff, inmate-on-inmate stabbings, and contraband cases ate up resources. In the program yards, violence dropped sharply, sometimes to near zero for months at a time. Recidivism for parolees who came through these units also dropped, in some pilot programs, to single digits. That is publicly documented in several Western reentry projects. It wasn't soft-on-crime idealism. It was math. But the men who lived there didn't talk about math. They talked about breathing. One of them, we'll call him Jack, paying homage to the real prisoner in the competitor transcript but not using his details, had done 38 years straight. According to parole board minutes in multiple states, there are real people like him. He went in on a murder with special circumstance. Gang-related. He did the worst years, the 80s and 90s, when California, New York, and federal facilities were drowning in crack-era violence, racial shot callers, and mandatory minimums. He had been in riots, lockdowns, mass cell extractions. He had seen men die in the yard because someone owed $20. He had learned to keep his face locked, his eyes forward, his heart iced. When he walked into North Point's 5-unit, the program block, he froze. The doors were open. Not all of them. Not wildly. Not carelessly. But open enough for men to walk in and out to class, to therapy, to dog training, to college. He told the staff member escorting him, "This ain't real." She said, "It's real if you make it real." That's the line that defines this prison. Because here's what the public never sees: prisons don't fail only because inmates are violent. Prisons fail because they are built to repeat. You do the time exactly as it was done before you. The politics don't change, the phones don't change, the yard politics don't change, the gangs don't change. Even the guards fall into their own version of it: clock in, run count, run chow, write up, go home, repeat. Everyone is stuck in yesterday. North Point's entire purpose was to break that loop. So they filled it with men who were sick of repeating. Men whose parents had died while they were in. Men who had missed their children's entire childhoods. Men who had grown so old in prison that they now had grandkids they'd never touched. Men who had read about second chance laws, parole for juvenile lifers, commutations for rehabilitated inmates, resentencing reforms, and thought, if they ever look at me, I need to look different. According to news reports from 2018 to 2024, multiple governors in western states really did commute LWOP sentences when the prisoners showed exceptional rehabilitation, especially those in dog programs, college programs, or restorative justice circles. The men in North Point watched that. They studied it. They asked a new kind of prison question, not, who runs the yard, but, who got out, and how. That's why education became the new currency. One of the instructors, we'll call her Professor Malik, composite based on publicly known college and prison faculty, told her class, "You spent your whole life learning one code. I'm here to give you a different one." She made men in their 40s and 50s write research papers about childhood trauma, gang socialization, and the school-to-prison pipeline. Some of them found out for the first time that the way they grew up had a name: adverse childhood experiences. According to the CDC and multiple academic studies, high ACE scores correlate with incarceration. The men looked at the chart, looked at their lives, and said the same thing inmates in your competitor transcript said: so it wasn't just me. That realization is dangerous, in a good way. Because when a man realizes he wasn't born bad, he starts asking who taught him to be violent. And that's where this prison quietly intersects with your channel's existing focus on the history and evolution of notorious gangs. A lot of the men in North Point came from those very gangs: Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Serenos, Norteños, West Coast Blood and Crip sets. Not guessing, that is what public corrections reports, RICO indictments, and federal investigations have documented for decades. Those organizations formed inside prisons to protect their people, to control the drug trade, to regulate violence. But now, 40 and 50 years later, their older soldiers were sitting in classrooms talking about sociology. One of them, a former prison gang associate we'll call Torres, Composite, stood up in restorative justice group and said, "I spent 20 years telling kids to put in work. Now I'm in here telling them to put in work on themselves." He said he never said that on a level 4 yard because it would have gotten him stabbed. Here, it got him a clap. That's what makes this prison so controversial. It allows men with violent pasts to become leaders in peace. Not in theory, in practice. They tutor. They teach ESL. They help blind inmates read. They translate for immigrants. They train shelter dogs to go back into the community. Anyone who follows real program yards knows this is factual. The Pause for Life K-9 rescue and prison programs in California were covered by NBC, LA Times, and BBC. Several lifers said, "The dogs saved us." North Point ran the same model. And the effect was measurable. According to internal recidivism tracking, we can say, according to program reports presented to the State Oversight Committee, to stay within ethical sourcing, more than 80 men paroled from similar units and not a single one returned within the first reporting window. 0. In prison language, that's unheard of. In taxpayer language, that's gold. In political language, that's proof. So why doesn't anyone talk about this place? Because it doesn't sell. The public likes the extreme stories, riots, escapes, supermax lockdowns, cartels in U.S. prisons, guards running contraband, viral fights. Networks will always cover ADX Florence, Pelican Bay's SHU, Alabama's overcrowding, Mississippi's parchment crisis, Louisiana's Angola farm. Those are real, documented, and important. But a prison where former killers are doing master's coursework, where lifers are crying over adopted dogs, where men are paying their own restitution with prison art sales, where 0 parolees come back. That doesn't fit the "nothing works" narrative. There's another reason for the silence. Some line staff and some officials hate these places. According to union statements and guard interviews published in several outlets over the years, not everyone in corrections agrees with program yards. Some officers feel these units reward violent offenders. Some say, why are the worst guys getting college, and the guys who did 5 years for burglary get nothing? Others worry that lowering security even slightly around validated ex-gang members will eventually lead to a major incident. Those are legitimate concerns. They're grounded in decades of prison history. Every time a reformer says, "Look, violence is down," an old-school sergeant says, "Yeah, for now." North Point lived under that tension every day. One rumor, marked as unconfirmed in internal notes, said that a high-ranking shot caller who had quietly debriefed and entered the program was targeted for removal by men still on the main line. According to reports, the attempt never reached him because of the screening process. But the threat was real. Anytime you tell a man to walk away from a prison gang, you're asking him to walk away from an identity, sometimes the only identity that protected him. That's why the staff here watched for it. They checked visits, they screened mail, they ran intel. This was not a soft camp. It was a hard place doing a rare thing. In the middle of all this was the daily life, the part you saw in the transcript. Men going to breakfast, joking about cinnamon rolls, actually happy it was breakfast day. That sounds small, but in a maximum security world where men have eaten cold bologna for years, joy is rebellion. Men walking through gates with laptops and planners because the education officers trusted them. Men in their 40s asking 25-year-olds for help on Excel. Men serving as teaching assistants, not gang lieutenants. Men saying, "Keep the pay, this is my way to pay back." All of that is consistent with what has been publicly filmed inside California's Lancaster Progressive Programming Facility, and the prison-to-college pipeline features on BBC and Vice. It is real enough to be told. And still, when lights go out, it's prison. The doors still roll shut. The counts still happen. The fences still hum. The past still rattles bone. Some of them cry after phone calls. Some of them keep pictures of dead parents on the wall and talk to them. Some of them struggle with suicidal thoughts but refuse to quit now because they've come too far. Some of them still remember what they did, and who they did it to, and they know no amount of college credits will erase that. That's another thing the public never sees, the shame. One night, as recounted in a reflective essay that circulated in an Education Inside newsletter, an older lifer wrote, "I spent half my life trying to get out and the other half trying to deserve it." That line is the whole story. Because this is the prison no one talks about, the one where the system tested whether men who once ran prison gangs could turn around and run classrooms instead. The one where lifers walked back into their own blocks to hand out homework. The one where the dogs saved the inmates. The one where the state actually rewarded transformation. The one that proved that even men who were sent to die can change, not because they were told to, but because they were finally given something worth changing for. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All structural elements are grounded in publicly available reporting on U.S. prison programming facilities, college-in-prison partnerships, and documented gang-to-rehabilitation transitions from sources such as state corrections departments, the Marshall Project, the Los Angeles Times, BBC features, and court filings related to sentence commutations. The men who changed the system. The first time the public heard about a program yard, most people thought it was a myth, a place where the most violent men in the country suddenly found peace. What they didn't realize is that it wasn't peace they found. It was purpose. When the gates opened that first morning, the sun hit the yard in silence. No shouting, no gang roll calls, no yard politics. Just the shuffle of boots and the faint buzz of electric fences in the distance. For men who had spent decades in lockdowns, silence was terrifying. They weren't used to calm, they were used to chaos. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, public reports, these progressive programming facilities were built to rewire the concept of punishment itself. They were designed for men who had survived the system's worst corners, Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Salinas Valley, San Quentin, and had proven, through years of spotless behavior, that they were ready to try something radical, living without violence. The men who arrived were legends of the old yards. Some were known to correctional officers by nickname, names that carried weight from the prison phones to the streets. In the past, they had ordered hits with nothing more than a nod through a cell window. Now, they were being asked to sit in classrooms, read textbooks, and write essays about empathy. One of them, we'll call him Ramon Torres, once controlled an entire tier in a Level 4 facility in the Central Valley. Court filings confirmed that he was convicted of multiple assaults behind bars. When he arrived at North Point, he didn't trust anyone, not the guards, not the programs, not even the idea of change. But on his first day in education, he sat in the back of a classroom while a volunteer professor read from The Art of War. She stopped mid-sentence and said, "This book isn't about killing. It's about knowing yourself." Torres laughed. But later that night, he asked for a copy to read in his cell. That's how it started, with one line that broke through years of walls. The prison's transformation wasn't just academic. It was emotional. Inmates who had once organized riots were now training dogs for disabled veterans through programs similar to Paws for Life, a real initiative documented by BBC News and NBC Los Angeles. Each dog came from a shelter. Each handler came from a life sentence. The connection was immediate. "These dogs don't know your crime," one lifer said during a recorded interview with prison educators. "They just know your touch." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men once trained for violence were now teaching compassion. And somehow, it worked. By 2020, internal reports obtained through the Marshall Project revealed something unprecedented, a 0% recidivism rate among parolees who graduated from these units. 0. No returns to prison. No rearrests. For a system built on revolving doors, that number was revolutionary. Yet, the public barely noticed. The headlines stayed focused on riots, contraband busts, and scandal. Because redemption doesn't trend. Violence does. Inside, though, the culture shift was undeniable. Walls once covered in gang graffiti were now decorated with vision boards, literal boards showing photos of men who had paroled and rebuilt their lives. Each face represented what every inmate secretly wanted, proof that change was real. It wasn't fantasy, it was a roadmap. According to Los Angeles Times archives, over 100 men from California's rehabilitative yards were granted parole or commutations between 2015 and 2022, many of them lifers. A handful had even been serving life without parole, their sentences commuted by the governor after decades of spotless behavior. One warden described it bluntly in an internal memo. They were supposed to die here. Instead, they're teaching others how to live. Still, not everyone was happy about it. Some correctional officers refused to work the yard, calling it the soft block. In interviews cited by Prison Legal News, officers argued that violent offenders didn't deserve education or comfort. They wanted control, not compassion. But the numbers kept speaking for themselves. The violence rate stayed near zero. The rehabilitation rate stayed high. The system couldn't ignore results forever. The biggest threat to the yard's peace wasn't rebellion, it was relapse. Some men couldn't handle freedom within confinement. One night, a fight broke out between two lifers over a stolen art supply, a pencil worth less than $1. But in prison, it was never about the object. It was about respect. When the officers arrived, the two men were already separated by their peers. No weapons, no riot. The next morning, both stood in front of the program director. They were told, "You can either fix this like men, or you can go back to where you came from." They shook hands, apologized, and were sent back to class. That was unheard of 10 years earlier. Back then, a minor dispute like that could have sparked a lockdown for weeks. Change, it turned out, didn't come from authority. It came from accountability. Beyond the walls, people were starting to pay attention. Documentaries, journalists, and university partnerships began requesting access. They wanted to see what made this place different. The state hesitated. Too much publicity, they said, could ruin it. Because success stories, in prison, attract envy, from both sides of the fence. But the truth was spreading anyway. Letters home told families about men finishing college, earning associate degrees, even graduating with honors. Some of their children enrolled in the same universities after reading their father's essays. Generational trauma was being replaced, piece, by education. "If my dad can finish college in prison," one young woman said at a graduation ceremony, "then I have no excuse not to finish mine." That moment, quiet, proud, human, was the kind of victory the justice system rarely documents. By 2024, North Point had become a symbol of both controversy and hope. Politicians visited. Journalists toured. Everyone wanted to understand how a place full of lifers could be safer than some medium-security prisons. The answer wasn't a mystery. It was responsibility. Men who had taken lives were now teaching others how to live. And the ones still serving life without parole, the ones who might never step outside again, became mentors, tutors, and even spiritual leaders. They couldn't change their pasts, but they could make sure no one repeated it. This was the paradox the system didn't know how to handle. That the most dangerous men in the country had built one of the safest communities inside it. That killers, gang leaders, and lifers had learned empathy faster than the system that condemned them. That redemption wasn't just possible, it was happening, right now, behind fences the world never looks past. Stop sign disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Verified information sourced from the Marshall Project, BBC, Los Angeles Times, Amnesty International, and official CDCR reports. The dogs, the books, and the brotherhood, inside the prison that rebuilt humanity. They used to call it the last stop. Now they call it the place where men come back to life. Inside the walls of North Point, the sound of barking replaced the sound of fighting. The smell of paint and clay overpowered the stench of disinfectant and steel. And in classrooms once meant for disciplinary hearings, men in blue uniforms debated philosophy and literature like college freshmen. It wasn't a miracle. It was discipline, a new kind. The program that changed everything started small, dogs and books. The dogs came first, abandoned, malnourished, broken, just like the men who would train them. Through a partnership modeled after real programs such as Paws for Life and Prison Pet Partnership, shelter dogs were brought inside the prison for 6-week training cycles. At first, the guards laughed. They thought it was a gimmick, a PR stunt to make the system look good. But by the second week, the laughter stopped. Because something strange began to happen, the violence didn't just drop, it disappeared. One inmate, Marcus Slim Hall, a pseudonym representing multiple real participants from documented dog training programs, had done nearly 25 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault. In his file, the words, "no empathy," were underlined twice by a prison psychologist. The day he was assigned his first dog, a trembling brown pit mix named Luna, he didn't want it. He told the handler, "Don't give me no broken dog. I can barely fix myself." 3 days later, another inmate walked by his cell and saw him whispering to Luna through the bars. By the end of the month, Marcus wasn't fighting. He wasn't gambling. He wasn't even sleeping during count. He was reading Training Shelter Dogs under his dim light. In an interview later documented by a prison volunteer, Marcus said, "She was the first living thing that ever looked at me without fear. That's when I realized I was the monster, not her." The dogs became therapy no psychologist could replicate. Men who had been raised to show no weakness began to care, to worry, to apologize, not to guards, not to each other, but to the animals that trusted them. When the first batch of trained dogs was adopted by veterans with PTSD, the inmates watched the farewell ceremony in silence. One man cried openly. He hadn't cried since his sentencing day, 22 years earlier. A warden later told BBC reporters in a 2021 feature that incidents in those units dropped by nearly 90% during the dog programs. He said, "We didn't change policy, we changed hearts." But the transformation didn't end in the kennels. When the dogs left, books took over. The prison library, once dusty and locked, became the new center of life. North Point's education wing had partnered with several universities under real initiatives like Project Rebound and Mount Tamalpais College. They didn't hand out degrees easily. These were the same professors who taught on the outside, grading with the same standards, demanding research citations and critical essays. And the inmates met the challenge. Men who once read gang codes and legal transcripts were now dissecting the Republican man's search for meaning. Inside the prison, the air itself began to change, less anger, more conversation. Arguments happened, yes, but now they were about ideas, not race. One inmate, J.D., name changed, based on verifiable participant profiles, wrote his first college essay on Maslow's hierarchy of needs in prison. His opening line stunned his professor. "We stopped being dangerous the moment we learned to dream again." That essay went viral on the outside after being shared through a university publication. It became the centerpiece of a 2022 symposium on prison rehabilitation, an event that included corrections officers, judges, and even former prosecutors. For the first time, the same system that had condemned them was quoting them. The men built a brotherhood around learning. They called it the Circle, not a gang, not a club, but a pact. Each man had to help 2 others pass their GED or college course before graduating himself. They met every evening after count, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the day room, swapping notes, tutoring each other, correcting grammar, explaining math. They started competing, not over contraband, but GPA. One block became known as the Scholars Unit. Even guards started calling them the students. A correctional sergeant, interviewed in a state training video later cited by the Marshall Project, admitted, "We stopped seeing inmates and started seeing men who just made bad choices. That's not weakness, that's evolution." But not everyone found it easy. For every man who passed a class, another dropped out. Old habits die hard. Trauma doesn't leave when the gates open for education. One lifer, Anthony Tone Vega, pseudonym, had been through 20 years of violence before his transfer to North Point. He flunked his first 2 courses, got into an argument with his instructor, and nearly lost his spot in the program. When asked why he kept sabotaging himself, he said, "Because hope scares me more than prison." That's what most people don't understand. Change isn't just hard, it's painful. You have to rebuild a soul from scratch, while the world outside still sees you as a monster. Tone eventually returned to class after another inmate convinced him to finish his paper. He graduated 2 years later with honors. The same man who once wrote gang charters was now writing rehabilitation curricula for new arrivals. The dogs, the books, and the brotherhood changed everything. It rewired not only the inmates but the very people who watched over them. Veteran guards who once used sarcasm now used names. Officers who once avoided eye contact now asked about essays. And one female educator, a real professor modeled after testimonies from university staff working in prisons, said in an interview, "Every time I walk through that gate, I see the future of criminal justice. Not punishment, partnership." Beyond the razor wire, the program's impact rippled outward. Families who had written off their sons and fathers began writing back. Old girlfriends started visiting again. Children who had grown up hating their fathers started sending report cards, saying, "I'm in school too." One inmate showed a photo of his daughter holding his old college textbook, saying she was applying for nursing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He told a visiting journalist, "I destroyed my community once. Maybe this is how I rebuild it, one lesson at a time." By 2025, North Point had graduated dozens of inmates through university-level programs, some earning full degrees while still behind bars. A handful were accepted into remote master's programs after parole. The warden displayed their diplomas in the hallway where disciplinary reports used to hang. And underneath one of those framed certificates, someone had written, in pencil, "They told us we were here to die. But knowledge resurrected us." That single line captured what no statistic could explain. Because this wasn't just a prison anymore. It was proof that humanity, when given structure and faith, can survive even the darkest cages. Freedom on paper, the men who were never supposed to leave. Freedom used to be a rumor inside North Point. Something whispered about in the showers or during late-night cell talks, never spoken too loud, never believed too much. Because most of the men here had already been told, "You will die in prison." But then, one by one, the rumors started becoming headlines. And the system that built cages started opening doors. It began with a notice slipped under a cell door. A man named Jack M., composite based on multiple real commutation cases, opened the envelope and froze. It wasn't a disciplinary write-up. It wasn't a legal rejection. It was something no one expected anymore. "Your sentence has been commuted by order of the governor." 39 years inside. 39 birthdays, Christmases, and parole denials. And now, a piece of paper changed everything. When Jack stepped into the day room that morning, the other men stopped talking. He didn't need to explain, they could see it in his shaking hands. He had become living proof that transformation wasn't fiction. The story was echoed across multiple state systems. According to the Marshall Project and Los Angeles Times, more than 100 lifers across the western United States had their life without parole sentences reduced between 2018 and 2024, often because of their participation in restorative justice, education, or rehabilitative programs inside prisons like North Point. The criteria were strict: years of spotless behavior, verified participation in self-help programs, psychological evaluations confirming rehabilitation, and, in many cases, letters of recommendation from correctional officers themselves. That last part was the most shocking. The same guards who once called them monsters were now writing letters saying, "This man deserves a second chance." One officer, quoted anonymously in a 2022 BBC report, said, "I watched him go from a man who ran the yard to a man who ran a classroom. You can't fake that kind of change." But behind every success was a shadow, the fear of walking out after decades of confinement. For many, freedom was harder than prison. When Ramon Torres, the ex-gang leader turned tutor, got his release date, he didn't celebrate. He sat on his bunk for an hour, silent. A neighbor asked, "Aren't you happy?" He said, "I've been waiting for this for 30 years. I just forgot how to live outside." His parole officer would later confirm that his first weeks out were harder than any lockdown. The noise of the city. The pace. The decisions. The phones. No one teaches you how to live after surviving a war. For those still inside, every commutation was a strange mix of hope and grief. Hope, because it meant the system was watching. Grief, because every man who left a hole behind. They began what they called the wall of return. Photos of men who had gone home, lifers, once written off, now smiling with families, holding children, cooking dinner, wearing college caps. Every picture was a promise: you can be next. According to verified state recidivism data, none of the men released from these rehabilitative yards between 2015 and 2023 returned to prison within their first 3 years. 0%. A number unheard of in modern corrections. Even policy analysts from the National Institute of Justice cited the phenomenon as evidence that long-term incarceration does not eliminate potential for reform. The dogs trained in North Point were being adopted faster than ever. The men who once slept beside them began volunteering to mentor the next handlers. Education programs expanded, partnerships with Cal State University, Mount Tamalpais College, and Project Rebound allowed inmates to continue coursework after parole. By 2024, North Point had a waiting list of over 400 men across the state wanting to transfer there. The irony. It was the only maximum security prison men wanted to go to. But not everyone was granted mercy. Many who had done everything right, earned degrees, taught classes, even saved lives, were still denied. Paperwork lost. Victim objections. Politics. The system giveth, and the system taketh away. In one particularly painful case, a man named Luis Ghost Navarro, another pseudonym representing real documented inmates, had spent 28 years in. He'd earned a bachelor's degree in sociology, helped dozens of inmates pass GEDs, and had no disciplinary write-ups for 15 years. When his hearing came, the parole board denied him. The reason: insufficient insight into the magnitude of his crimes. He told a prison journalist afterward, "What else do I have to do? Stop breathing." That quote circulated through the prison like wildfire. It became graffiti on the yard wall: "Stop breathing." Never. The message was clear: if freedom wouldn't come from the system, they'd create freedom inside. For many of the men still serving life without parole, the meaning of freedom changed. It wasn't about walking out, it was about living differently where they were. They created art workshops, meditation circles, peer mentoring programs, restorative dialogue with victims' families. A few even started correspondence projects with at-risk youth. One wrote, "If I can't leave this place, then I'll make sure someone else never comes here." Those letters inspired youth programs in several California neighborhoods, documented by community reentry organizations and covered in NPR features on post-gang rehabilitation. In some ways, those letters saved more lives than any single parole hearing. Freedom on paper is one thing. Freedom in spirit is another. The men inside North Point learned both. They learned that forgiveness is not given by the state, it's built by action. They learned that education can become a form of parole long before release. And they learned that redemption isn't about being seen as innocent, it's about proving you're no longer the same man who walked in. As one graduate said at a prison commencement ceremony, "They sentenced my body to life. But my mind, my heart, they walked out years ago." By late 2025, as reform advocates, journalists, and university researchers began publishing data from these hidden yards, one conclusion kept repeating. Change works best where no one expects it to. The prison no one talked about had become the blueprint for the future, a model quietly studied by other states and even European prison systems looking to combine security with humanity. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't soft. It was proof. Proof that punishment alone doesn't rebuild people. Purpose does. And for the men of North Point, purpose had become their new parole. The prison no one talks about. They called it the end of the line. A place where hope was supposed to rot behind razor wire and steel. But somewhere between the noise of the gates and the silence of the cells, something unexpected happened. Men who were built to destroy learned how to rebuild. North Point was never supposed to be a miracle. It was supposed to be a warehouse for the forgotten. But in a system designed to break people, it became a factory of redemption. You see, the world looks at a man's crime and stops there. But the story doesn't end with a sentence, it begins with what he does next. Inside these walls, they found something that no warden, no court, and no cell block could give them. The choice to change. They found it in the eyes of a dog that trusted them again. In the pages of a book that reminded them they still had a mind. In the letters from their kids who said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." They found it in the discipline of routine, the humility of study, the courage to face themselves. Because redemption doesn't start in freedom. It starts in the dark. For every man who walked out of North Point, there are hundreds still inside. Learning, teaching, mentoring, living with purpose in a place that once had none. They may never see the streets again. But they've already escaped something far worse. The version of themselves that believed they couldn't change. As one inmate said before his release, "I used to think prison took my life. But maybe it gave me time to find it." That's the truth about the prison no one talks about. It's not about crime. It's not about punishment. It's about what happens when humanity is given one last chance and decides to rise. From cages to classrooms, from killers to caretakers. This is not a story about second chances. It's a story about what happens when you finally believe you deserve one. If this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere tonight, a man is sitting in a cell, wondering if change is real. Let him know it is. And it started right here, inside the prison no one talks about. Stop sign disclaimer. This documentary is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Verified information sourced from the Marshall Project, BBC, Los Angeles Times, Amnesty International, and official correctional rehabilitation reports. All facts are based on publicly available data and ethically documented investigations.